My wife handed me divorce papers at my father's funeral, when aware that he was a secret billionaire, not before, not after. At it, 40 minutes after they put him in the ground, while the red clay dirt was still fresh on the hill behind us, and the other mourners were still making their way to their cars. She pressed a manila envelope into my hand in the cemetery parking lot, her sister standing a few feet away like a quiet witness, and she said she'd had them notarized already. Said she hadn't wanted to do it at the house. I took the envelope. I looked at it. I put it in the breast pocket of my suit jacket, right against my chest, and I walked to my car and I drove home. What my wife did not know, what nobody standing in that parking lot could have known, is that 3 hours before the service, I had received a phone call that changed the material facts of my entire life. My father's attorney, a woman I had known for years, and what she told me, sitting in my car outside the funeral home while I was still knotting my tie, is something I had not yet told a single living person. Before you assume you know where this is going, stay with me, because this story is not about money. It was never about money. It is about what a man inherits from his father that doesn't show up in any legal document, and what it costs when you love someone in a language they were never taught to read. I'm Calvin Price, and this is the long receipt. Adrian Moss called me at 7:41 in the morning. I was sitting in the parking lot of Moss & Associates on Chestnut Street, still in my car, still in my good suit. Asked because I had driven there before the service to sign some preliminary paperwork, and she had asked me to come in early. Just routine estate documentation, she said on the phone the night before. 30 minutes in and out. I figured I had time. What happened in that office was not 30 minutes of routine documentation. Adrienne sat across from me at her desk, hands folded, and she told me that my father's estate had been fully assessed. She told me that James Elmore Price, retired operator of Scepter Route 52, had been a silent founding investor in a Philadelphia logistics company called Northbound Freight Partners since 1991. She told me that Northbound was acquired 18 months ago by a national freight conglomerate called Meridian Logistics Group in a deal that closed at $1.1 billion. She told me that my father's stake, which he had never diluted, never sold, and never mentioned to a single living person outside of this office, was valued at the time of acquisition at just over $112 million. She told me it had been rolled into a trust. She told me I was the sole beneficiary. I did not say anything for a long time. Adrienne let the silence sit. She was good at her job. When I finally spoke, I asked her one question. I asked her if my father had known at the end what the number was going to be. She said yes. She said he had known for almost 2 years. I nodded. I signed the papers she needed me to sign. I thanked her. I walked back to my car, sat down, and stared at the dashboard of my 2014 Ford Fusion for a while. Then I drove to Elmwood Cemetery to bury my father. I don't remember much about the service itself. I remember the specific grey of the sky, the kind of flat November grey that doesn't threaten rain, it just refuses to do anything else. I remember the Scepter men in the 3rd row, 6 of them retired, in their good coats, sitting together without being asked to. I remember my wife Renee in the 2nd row in black, composed the way she was always composed in public, her sister Portia beside her. I remember my father's casket. I remember the red clay dirt. What I don't remember is the words the pastor spoke, people nodded, someone sang. I stood where I was supposed to stand and did what I was supposed to do, but my mind was somewhere on Chestnut Street, in a leather chair across from Adrienne Moss, sitting with a number I had no container for, $112 million. My father drove the same bus route for 51 years. He owned one vehicle at a time, always used, always maintained, past the point most people would have let it go. He bought his suits at a department store on Broad Street and wore them until the elbows said otherwise. He did not vacation. He did not explain himself. And for 32 years, while he was doing all of that, he was also doing something else entirely. Something that nobody standing at that graveside had any idea about, including my wife. 40 minutes after they put him in the ground, while the other mourners were finding their cars, Renee walked to where I was standing at the edge of the lot and held out a manila envelope. She held it the way you hold something you have been holding for a while and are relieved to finally set down. She said she'd had them notarized the day before. She said she hadn't wanted to do it at the house. I looked at the envelope. I looked at the fresh dirt on the hill behind her. I took the envelope and I put it in the breast pocket of my suit jacket, directly over my chest, and I said, okay. That was the whole conversation. Portia was standing about 15 feet away, close enough to witness, far enough to pretend she wasn't. Renee walked back to her car, I walked to mine. I put the Fusion in drive and I pulled out of Elmwood Cemetery with a manila envelope in my breast pocket and $112 million in a trust account I hadn't touched, and my father 4 feet underground, and the November sky doing nothing at all. The envelope sat on the passenger seat the entire drive home. I didn't open it. I already knew what it said. Now, if you're just finding this channel, hit subscribe before we go any further. And drop a comment. I want to know where in the world you're listening from. And now let me tell you how we got here. To understand how I got to that parking lot, you have to understand my father. And to understand my father, you have to start with his father first. My grandfather, Elmore Price, was a Pullman porter. He worked the Northeast Corridor from 1951 to 1974, making beds and carrying bags and saying, "Yes, sir," to men who never learned his name. He was also, by the time he retired, the quiet owner of 3 rental properties in King Sessing and a vacant commercial lot on Baltimore Avenue that he bought for $11,000 in 1968 and held without touching for 22 years. Nobody knew about the properties except his wife and his attorney. But that was a deliberate choice. Elmore had watched what happened to a man named Curtis Briggs, his closest friend on the railroad, who came into a modest inheritance in 1961 and made the mistake of letting people see it. Within 4 years, Curtis had been swindled by a cousin, pressured by a brother-in-law, and manipulated by a church deacon who convinced him to invest in a laundromat that never opened. By 1966, Curtis had nothing left but the original house he started with. Elmore watched all of it happen from 10 feet away and made himself a promise that became a rule, that became a philosophy that he passed to Jimmy and Jimmy passed to me. The rule was simple. You don't show the hand, you play it. My father lived that rule completely. He took the job at Scepter in 1969 because it paid steady and had a pension, and those two things, what in his calculation, were worth more than ambition. He drove Route 52 for 51 years. He knew every stop by the feel of the road. He bought the King Sessing row house in 1979 for $38,000, and he never moved. From the outside, James Price was a man who had found his lane early and stayed in it for half a century. That reading was not wrong, it was just incomplete. In 1991, my father had 22 years of savings, a paid-off house, and a specific quality of attention that most people never develop. The ability to watch something grow quietly without needing to talk about it. He had been watching a small freight operation called Northbound Partners for 2 years. 2 men he knew professionally, Marcus Webb, and a man named Gerald Tatum, Otti had started it out of a warehouse space in Kensington with 3 trucks and a contract to handle last-mile delivery for a regional grocery chain. They needed capital to expand. They weren't looking for a partner with a name. They were looking for someone patient with money and no need for recognition. My father fit that description precisely. He put in $47,000, every dollar he had saved beyond his emergency cushion, plus $8,000 he borrowed from his own father, which he repaid in full within 2 years. Marcus Webb and Gerald Tatum each held 30%. My father held 40%. He never attended a meeting. He never put his name on a truck. Would he established an LLC in 1993 through Adrian Moss's predecessor at the same firm, a man named Charles Whitfield, who had handled Elmore's properties, and he called it JPE Holdings. He set up a P.O. box on Woodland Avenue for all correspondence. He updated his instructions to the firm every 5 years in writing, sitting in the same chair in Charles Whitfield's office and later in Adrian's. He treated it like maintenance, like changing the oil in a car you intend to keep running. Northbound grew, slowly at first, then steadily, then significantly. By 2004, they had 41 trucks and contracts with 4 regional distribution networks. By 2012, they were operating in 6 states. By 2019, Meridian Logistics Group, a national freight conglomerate, had opened acquisition conversations. Those conversations took 3 years. The deal closed 18 months before my father died. $1.1 billion total enterprise value. My father's 40% stake, which had never been diluted because he had never needed anything from the company beyond what patience would eventually produce, came out at just over $112 million. He was living in the same house on the same block, driving the same kind of truck he had always driven when that number landed in a trust account with my name on it. He never said a word to me about the acquisition while it was happening. The first I heard of any final number was Adrian Moss's voice on my phone at 7:41 in the morning in a parking lot on Chestnut Street. But here is the thing I need you to understand. He had told me the shape of it when I was 22. Not the number. The number wasn't knowable then, but the structure, the LLC, the philosophy behind it, or the reason Elmore had built the rule and the reason Jimmy had kept it. He sat me down at that kitchen table 2 weeks after I graduated from Temple, and he explained it the way he explained everything. Once, clearly, without repetition, expecting it to land. He said the rule wasn't about hiding, it was about protecting. He said visible wealth in the wrong environment doesn't just attract bad actors, it changes how people see you before you've had a chance to show them who you are. He said his father watched a good man get consumed by what people thought he had, and he had made a decision that his family would never be exposed to that same current. Then he looked at me across that kitchen table and he said, "Let the work speak." I was 22 years old. I had grown up watching a man live that philosophy with complete integrity. I believed it without reservation. I carried it into my career. I carried it into my savings habits. And 3 years later, I carried it into my marriage to a woman named Renee Caldwell, whose family had built their entire identity on the opposite principle, that the work didn't really speak until everyone in the room could hear it. That collision didn't make noise right away. It never does. It just builds pressure, quietly, the way water finds a crack. The first 3 years were good. I want to say that clearly because it matters. Renee and I were not a mistake from the beginning. We were 2 people who genuinely chose each other, and for a while that choice felt solid enough to build on. She was sharp and warm, and she laughed easily, which I have always thought is one of the most underrated qualities a person can have. She was proud of me in those early years in a way that felt uncomplicated. She told her co-workers her husband was steady. She said it like it was the highest compliment. Maybe it was then. We had a 1-bedroom apartment in Germantown, then a house in Mount Airy when we could manage it. and we built our life incrementally and carefully, and it felt like the right pace for both of us. Then Leon landed the Jefferson Health contract. That was year 4. His medical staffing agency had been growing for 2 years, but the Jefferson contract was a different level, a 3-year regional agreement worth somewhere north of $4 million in total billings. Leon threw a dinner at his house in Cheltenham to celebrate. Big house, new furniture, catered, the kind of event where the hosting itself is the point. I went because Renee wanted to go and because Leon was her brother, and I did not have a principled reason to decline. Somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, Leon made a toast. He talked about grinding and betting on yourself and not letting anybody put a ceiling on your vision. It was a good toast, he meant it. And then he looked across the table at me with a kind of expansive generosity that had condescension built into its foundation, and he said something like, "Calvin keeps it steady over there at the distribution company," and everyone nodded the way people nod when they are being polite about something they have already privately assessed. I smiled, I raised my glass, I said congratulations and meant it. On the drive home, Renee was quiet in a way I had not heard before, not angry, just recalibrating something. While year 6 was the first direct conversation. We were in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, and she asked me why we weren't doing more. Not accusatory, not yet. Genuinely curious, the way you ask a question when you still believe the answer might satisfy you. She meant financially, she meant professionally, she meant in the visible, measurable ways that her family used to track whether a life was progressing correctly. I told her we were doing fine. I told her the savings were solid and the house was appreciating and there was no emergency. All of that was true. None of it answered what she was actually asking. She looked at me for a moment and then she nodded, and she let it go. But she didn't let it go. She filed it somewhere and added to it over the years that followed, and that file got heavier than I understood at the time. And by year 8, she was talking to Portia about the marriage. I didn't know this directly. I pieced it together from the way Portia started looking at me at family gatherings, a particular kind of careful politeness that people adopt when they know more about your situation than they're supposed to. The external narrative had solidified by then. In the Caldwell family's language, Calvin Price was a man who had plateaued, comfortable, steady. Those words again, but drained of the admiration they once carried. I understood what was happening. I just didn't know how to correct it without dismantling the thing my father had built his entire life around. Then came year 9. October, a Tuesday evening. I was at my desk in the home office and Renee came in to ask me something about the weekend. While she was standing there, she noticed a piece of paper on the corner of my desk. I saw her eyes land on it the moment it registered. An envelope from Moss and Associates with the return address visible, and below my name the notation that it regarded the JPE Holdings trust account correspondence requested by beneficiary. She picked it up before I could think of a natural reason to reach for it first. She asked what it was. I told her it was my father's savings account, that he had set up a small trust years ago, and I helped him manage the correspondence occasionally. I kept my voice exactly level. I said it the way you say something unremarkable, because it is unremarkable. She looked at the envelope for another moment. Then she set it down and asked me what I wanted for dinner. That was the closest it ever came. A one envelope on one corner of one desk on a Tuesday evening in October. If she had read what was inside, or if I had hesitated for even a half-second longer before answering, the entire sequence that followed would have been different. The marriage might have survived, it might not have, but it would have been a different story. Instead, she made pasta and I washed the dishes, and we watched television, and the envelope sat on my desk, and the distance between us continued its quiet, patient expansion. 8 months later, Jimmy's doctor used the word terminal. Renee filed 2 weeks after that. I found out later that she had already consulted the attorney before the diagnosis, had already been considering it for some time, and that Jimmy's prognosis simply removed the last reason she had been finding to wait. And she told me she didn't want to waste more time. I did not ask her to define what she meant by waste. The notarization date on the papers she handed me in that cemetery parking lot was 11 days before my father died. She had already signed her name before he was gone. I don't say that to indict her. I say it because it is the precise geography of where we had arrived. Two people in the same marriage operating on completely different information, making completely different calculations, and neither one of us fully wrong about the facts we could actually see. I drove to Jimmy's house after I left the cemetery. Not home. To his house. I don't know that I made a conscious decision about it. The fusion just went there, the way it knew certain roads by memory, and I let it. I had a key on my ring that I had carried for 11 years. Then I stood on the front step on King Sessing Avenue and used it for the first time since my father was alive. The lock turned the same way it always had, slightly stiff at the top of the rotation, then smooth. Jimmy had known about that stiffness for as long as I could remember and had never fixed it. Some things you just accommodate. The house smelled like him. I don't know how else to say it. Not cologne, not food, just the accumulated presence of one man living carefully in the same space for 44 years. I stood in the front hallway for a moment and let that land. I went into the kitchen first. The dish rack beside the sink had one mug and one plate in it, washed and drying. He had done dishes the morning before he went to the hospital for the last time. That was Jimmy Price. You don't leave a mess for someone else to deal with. And I went into the small room he used as an office, more of a reading room really. A desk and 2 chairs and shelves with books and binders organized by year. I found the ledger on the second shelf where Adrienne had told me it would be. It was a standard composition notebook, black cover, but thick. He had taped additional pages inside the back when he ran out of room. 32 years of handwritten entries in his careful, compressed print, dates, numbers, notes in the margins. The first entry was from March of 1991, $47,000. Northbound Partners' initial contribution. The last entry was from 14 months ago. A single line noting that the Meridian acquisition had closed and that the trust transfer was complete and that Adrienne had the documentation. Between those 2 entries was the entire hidden architecture of my father's financial life. Every decision he made, every year he held, every time he could have taken money out and chose not to. I did not read it all that night. I just held it and understood for the first time the full weight of what he had carried and how long he had carried it without anyone to share the load with. There was an envelope tucked inside the back cover, my name on the front in his handwriting. Not the estate documents. Adrienne had those. This was something else. A personal letter, sealed. I took the ledger and the envelope and I sat down in his chair, the one in the corner of the living room where he read every evening after dinner. The upholstery was worn smooth on the armrests from decades of use. I sat in it, and I opened the envelope and I read what he had written. I am not going to tell you what the letter said. And some things belong only to the person they were written for. But I will tell you this, he knew. He knew that the silence had a cost. He knew that the philosophy he had handed me was built for a different world than the one I was trying to live in. And he said so directly, in his plain, declarative way. He did not apologize for teaching me what he taught me. He believed in it, but he wanted me to understand the distinction he had arrived at too late himself, which was that protecting something and withholding something are not the same act, even when they look identical from the outside. I sat in that chair for a long time after I finished reading. Here is the thing I had never let myself fully see before that night. I had told myself for 10 years that my silence in the marriage was about protecting Jimmy's trust. And that was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I had also learned from the ground up to treat my interior life as something that did not require explanation. Jimmy never explained himself to anyone. I grew up believing that was strength. What I had not understood, until I sat in his chair with his letter in my lap, was that Jimmy lived alone. He built alone. He carried it alone. And the aloneness was not a side effect of the philosophy, it was the price he paid for it, a price he paid willingly for his own reasons that I had absorbed without understanding the cost. I had brought that price into a marriage and expected Renée to pay it alongside me without ever telling her what she was paying for. That was my failure, not the secrecy itself. The assumption that love was sufficient explanation for silence. I thought about my options. I could call my own attorney in the morning and begin contesting the divorce proceedings. I could disclose the estate on my own terms, use it as leverage, change the dynamics of the negotiation entirely. I had that ability. Adrienne had already made clear that the numbers were substantial enough to reshape any conversation significantly. I decided not to do that, not because I was certain it was the right choice, but because Jimmy had never used what he had as a weapon, and I did not want the first active decision I made with this inheritance to be one he would not have recognized. The legal process would proceed. Adrienne would file the estate. Pennsylvania law would do what Pennsylvania law does. Whatever Renée learned, she would learn through the proper mechanism, or not from me handing it to her as a counter-argument. If the truth was going to matter, it needed to arrive on its own. I folded the letter. I placed it back in the envelope. I set the envelope on the kitchen table beside the ledger. Then I sat there in the quiet of my father's house and I let the day finish arriving. Adrienne filed the estate documentation on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the funeral. I was not present. I did not need to be. She had everything she required, and she knew how to do her job without my supervision. I went to work that day and came home to Jimmy's house that evening and ate dinner at his kitchen table and did not think about what the filing would set in motion, because thinking about it would not change the timeline, and I had learned from my father that some processes you simply have to let run. What I know about the next several days I reconstructed afterward, partly from what Renée told me and partly from what I could infer. I was not in the rooms where it happened, but I have thought about it enough times that I can trace the shape of it. Pennsylvania law is specific on this point. When an estate is filed and there are active divorce proceedings involving the decedent's heir, both parties' attorneys receive disclosure of any assets that may qualify as marital property. The letter that went to Renée's attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, who practiced out of an office in Center City, arrived on a Monday. It was a formal document, estate designation, asset summary, trust valuation, numbers on paper the way numbers always start before they become something a person has to sit with. A tea by Patricia Osei called Renée at 11:47 that same morning. I know the time because Renée told me later with the precision of someone who had replayed the moment many times. She said she was at her desk at work when her phone rang and Patricia's name came up and she answered expecting a routine update on the proceedings. She said Patricia's voice was different from the start, careful in a way that made Renée sit up straighter before the first sentence was finished. I don't know everything Patricia said. I know it was enough. Renée called Léon before she left the parking garage. That much I know because Leon called me 2 days later, which I'll get to. She needed to tell someone who would react the way she was reacting, someone who could match the size of what she was holding. Leon's reaction, from what I understand, I moved through disbelief first. Then he asked her to repeat the number. Then he was quiet in a way that Renee said she had never heard from him before, which was its own kind of answer. She called Portia that same evening. Portia, who had been Renee's closest counsel through the entire deterioration of the marriage, who had sat with her through every grievance and validated every conclusion. Renee told me later that Portia went quiet too, but differently than Leon. Portia asked one question that Renee had not yet asked herself. She asked whether this changed anything, not the legal situation. Whether it changed anything, Renee said she didn't answer. She said she just sat with the question in the silence and eventually changed the subject. She called me on a Wednesday, 7:43 in the evening. I was in Jimmy's workshop at the back of the house, going through his tools, organizing them mostly. It was something to do with my hands. My phone lit up on the workbench, and I saw her name, and I picked it up on the second ring. She asked me if I knew. I told her yes. I told her I had found out the morning of the funeral. There was a silence then that had real weight to it. Not the comfortable silence of two people who know each other well enough to not need words. The other kind. The kind that contains everything that is trying to find its shape. She asked me why I hadn't told her. Not about the trust specifically. About any of it. About the fact that Jimmy had built something, that there was something to know, that the man she had spent 10 years measuring against her family's standard of visible success had been operating in an entirely different dimension that none of them had access to. I thought about the question for a long time before I answered. Not performing. Just making sure I said the true thing rather than the convenient one. I told her it was because that was how my father loved people. Quietly. I told her he had built the whole thing in silence and carried it alone for 30 years. And I had grown up believing that was what integrity looked like. I told her I had brought that into our marriage without understanding that it was a philosophy designed for a man who lived alone, and that I had no right to ask her to live inside it without her knowledge or her consent. I told her that was my failure, not the secret itself. The assumption that she should trust an outcome she was never shown the shape of. She didn't say anything for a while after that. Then she said she had stood in that parking lot and handed me those papers the day we buried him. I said I knew. She said she hadn't known. She said that mattered to her. That she needed me to understand that if she had known, she would not have done it that way. I told her I believed her. We stayed on the phone for another few minutes without either of us having anything more to say. Then she said she needed to think. I said that was fine. I told her to take whatever time she needed. She said good night. I said good night. And the call ended. I set the phone down on Jimmy's workbench. I sat down on the stool he kept beside it. The workshop was quiet, and the tools were organized, and outside the window the block was doing what it always did in the evening, which was nothing remarkable and nothing wrong. I sat there for a long time. 6 weeks after the funeral, I moved into Jimmy's house on King Sessing Avenue, not because I had to. I still had legal access to the house Renee and I shared in Mount Airy. The proceedings weren't finalized, and Patricia Osei had communicated through Adrienne that Renee was requesting 6 months before any final signature. I agreed to that without conditions or counter-requests. 6 months was reasonable. I was not in a position to demand clarity from someone I had kept in the dark for a decade. I moved to King Sessing because it was where I needed to be. The house required attention, not emergency repairs, Jimmy had maintained it carefully, but the kind of steady stewardship that a property needs when the person who understood it completely is no longer present. I learned the boiler. I learned which windows needed weather stripping before February. I ate breakfast at his kitchen table every morning, and I let the house teach me what it knew. Renee and I did not speak during those 6 weeks. That was not hostility. It was two people honoring the space that had been requested. I did not know what she was thinking or deciding. I had stopped trying to predict her, which was something I probably should have done years earlier. 3 weeks into my time at the house, Marcus Webb called me. Marcus was one of the two men who had built Northbound with my father in 1991. He was 63 years old and still working, running a smaller freight consulting operation out of an office in Germantown. He said he had seen the estate filing and wanted to reach out personally before too much time passed. As he said, he had known my father for 34 years and wanted me to understand something that the legal documents could not convey. He said Jimmy Price was the reason Northbound survived its 3rd year. Not because of the money, though the money mattered. Because in the spring of 1994, when the grocery contract fell through and Gerald Tatum wanted to dissolve the partnership and cut their losses, Jimmy had driven to a diner on Germantown Avenue and sat across from both of them and laid out calmly and without drama exactly why the thesis was still sound and exactly how long they needed to hold to see it prove itself. He said Jimmy spoke for maybe 12 minutes total. He said Gerald Tatum changed his mind before the coffee arrived. Marcus said, "Your father never needed anybody to know what he was. He just needed the thing to work." But I thanked him. After we hung up, I sat with that for a long time. I want to speak to you directly now, if that's all right, because this story is almost finished, and there are a few things I have been turning over since that Wednesday night on the phone with Renee, and I think they belong out loud. The first is this. Patience and silence are not the same thing, and I spent 10 years treating them as if they were. Patience is a decision about timing. Silence is a decision about access. My father's patience built something extraordinary. My silence cost me a marriage. Both things came from the same source and produced completely different outcomes. And the difference was not the quality of the intention. It was whether another person was inside the decision with me. The second thing is harder to say. I inherited an emotional architecture from a man I loved and respected completely, and I installed it in a life it was not designed for without ever questioning whether it fit. My father lived alone. He built alone. The privacy that protected him would have protected a marriage too, if I had been willing to let my wife stand inside it with me instead of outside it. I never gave her that option. I told myself I was protecting the trust. I was also protecting myself from the vulnerability of being fully known. Those two things lived so close together for so long that I stopped being able to tell them apart. The third thing is the one that costs the most to acknowledge. Renee was not wrong about the distance she felt. She was wrong about what caused it. But the distance was real, and I put it there, and I maintained it for years while telling myself it was necessary. A person can only interpret what they can see. I gave her so little to see that she built her own explanation, and I cannot hold that against her, not honestly. The fourth thing is about Jimmy. He left me $112 million and a house and a ledger and a letter. The letter is the part one returned to, because what he was really leaving me was the part of the lesson he had arrived at too late himself, that building something that outlasts you only means something if the people you love can find themselves somewhere inside what you built. He knew that at the end. He wanted me to know it sooner. I think of what my grandfather Elmore called it, and what Jimmy called it, and what I am learning to call it now. The long receipt. Not the balance at the bottom, but the whole record. Every entry, every decision, every year of quiet work and quiet holding and quiet love that doesn't announce itself but accumulates, line by line, into something that cannot be argued with when the full document finally comes to light. That's what they left me. The question I am living now is what I do with it. Before I tell you the last part, I want to ask you something. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, you've thought about someone, a person in your life who built quietly, who never explained themselves, who you may have misread because they didn't speak your language. Drop their name in the comments if you're willing, or just tell me where in the world you're listening from. This channel exists because of you, and I don't take that lightly. Now, the last part. It was a Tuesday evening, 7 weeks after the funeral. I was sitting at Jimmy's kitchen table with the estate documents spread out in front of me. Trust summary, asset inventory, the northbound acquisition paperwork that Adrienne had organized into a folder I had been working through slowly, page by page. I had pulled open the junk drawer looking for a pen and found, underneath the rubber bands and the dead batteries and the take-out menus from restaurants that had probably closed years ago, a folded scepter schedule from 1987, Route 52, my father's route. The paper was soft at the creases from decades of folding and unfolding, which meant he had carried it for a while before it ended up in that drawer. I set it on the table next to the trust documents. 2 pieces of paper. One worth more money than most people will see in 10 lifetimes. One worth nothing at all. On both of them, my father's whole life, present in the same square foot of kitchen table, in the same house he had lived in for 44 years. I looked at them for a long time. Then I got up, filled a glass of water at the sink, came back to the table, and sat down again. I picked up the pen I had been looking for, and I started writing, not to an attorney, not to a financial advisor, to Renee, not to save the marriage, not to explain myself, just to say in plain language what I should have said years ago before the distance had time to harden into a wall neither of us could see clearly enough to climb. I don't know how the 6 months will end. That's the truth. And I have learned to be more careful about pretending I know things I don't. What I know is that I am sitting in my father's house, at my father's table. It's with his whole life in front of me. And for the first time in a long time, I'm not keeping anything to myself that belongs to someone else. That's a beginning. For a price man, that's no small thing.